We're learning new information about the Illinois militia leader accused in the bombings of a mosque in Bloomington. Documents that were just unsealed say the man may have taken orders from so-called higher-ups. Lou Raguse is in the newsroom with details. Lou?
Carla, there are 3 suspects in the bombing of the Dar al-Farouk Muslim Center in Bloomington. And these new documents show that 2 of the suspects have cooperated extensively with the FBI as they build a case against the suspected leader. Now, that suspected leader is Michael Hari. According to the documents, one of the other suspects, Michael McWhorter, confessed his own role and told the FBI agents that it was Hari's idea to bomb the mosque. And Hari was driving the getaway vehicle when the other suspect, Joe Morris, smashed the mosque window and McWhorter threw the bomb inside. And McWhorter went on to tell agents he's heard Hari talk on the phone to so-called higher-ups and uses an email address that hides location information to communicate with them. The 3rd suspect, Joe Morris, gave agents access to that email as part of what the documents call a cooperation agreement. He revealed that there are about 13 other militia groups similar to theirs, and Hari would use the email to talk with them as well as the higher-ups who he said would command them to carry out terrorist acts. Hari's trial is scheduled for November, Carla.
All right. Thank you for the latest, Lou. Appreciate it.